The photographer tapped my shoulder at my own daughter's wedding and asked me, politely, to step out of the family portrait. Immediate family only, sir. I'm so sorry. I want you to sit with that sentence a moment the way I had to. Because in about 4 hours, I was going to walk that same photographer through a building I own down to the light fixtures, and not one person in that reception hall is going to be laughing anymore. My name is Roland Fenwick. Everybody who's known me longer than 5 minutes calls me Ro. I'm 58 years old. I still swing a hammer most weeks whether I need to or not, and I drive a 2011 Ford F-150 with 230,000 miles on it because I like the way it handles, and I've never once cared what a truck says about a man. What most people in Charleston high society didn't know about me, including the family my daughter Sadie was about to marry into, was that I also happen to own Fenwick Bar and Vineyard Estates, 3 restored properties across the Lowcountry that host roughly 400 weddings a year, including, as it happened, the exact one my daughter was standing inside of that afternoon. Let me back up, because you need to understand how a man ends up invisible at his own daughter's wedding. And it doesn't happen in one afternoon. It happens over about 14 months, one small cut at a time, until you're standing in a hallway being asked to step out of a photograph. My wife Joanne and I built our life the unglamorous way. I started as a framer in my 20s, worked my way into general contracting by 30, and somewhere around 40, I bought a rundown tobacco barn outside Somerville on a whim, mostly because Joanne fell in love with the bones of it on a Sunday drive and wouldn't stop talking about it. I restored it myself, nights and weekends, for 2 years. We hosted our niece's wedding there as a favor. Word got around, and within 5 years I had 3 properties and a business that ran itself well enough that I could have stopped swinging a hammer entirely. I never did. I like the work. I like showing up on job sites in old jeans and a flannel shirt, and I like that nobody at lumberyard has ever once asked me what my portfolio's worth. Joanne used to tease me that I dress like a man who owed money instead of a man who was owed it. She wasn't wrong, and I never saw a reason change. By the time Sadie got engaged, Fenwick Restoration and Holdings employed 41 people across 3 properties and pulled in a number I've never once said out loud to anyone outside my accountant's office. Not because I'm ashamed of it, but because I've watched what that number does to how people treat you the second they learn it. And I'd spent 30 years building relationships with people who liked me before they knew it. My accountant, a dry, precise man named Julius who's kept my books for 2 decades, once told me I was the only client he had who seemed actively uncomfortable being told his own net worth. He wasn't wrong about that either. Money's a tool I understand well enough to use skillfully. I've just never wanted it to be the first thing anybody knew about me, including, as it turned out, my own daughter's future in-laws. Sadie's my only child, 29 years old, sharp as a tack, an architect in her own right, working for a firm downtown. She met Bennett Ashcroft at a gallery opening 2 years back, and I liked him from the first dinner. Still do mostly. Bennett works in his family's investment firm, Old Charleston Money, the kind of family whose name is on a library wing and a hospital pavilion, the kind of family that's been throwing garden parties on the Battery since before my grandfather learned to read. Bennett himself never once looked down his nose at me. That's important to remember, because everything I'm about to tell you happened around him, mostly without his knowledge, orchestrated almost entirely by his mother, Constance Ashcroft. I want to be fair to her, so let me start with what I liked. She's sharp, formidable, runs 3 charity boards, and clearly adores her son. Sadie told me once, early on, that Constance had personally raised more money for the Children's Hospital in a single year than the previous 3 board chairs combined, and I believed it. The woman has a gift for making people want to open their wallets, which is its own kind of skill I've never had much talent for myself. Why didn't like revealed itself slowly, the way water finds a crack in a foundation. The first time Joanne and I had dinner at the Ashcroft house on Laguerre Street, Constance looked at my hands, just looked at them, at the calluses and the scar across my left knuckle from table saw accident in 2003, and said, with a smile that never touched her eyes, "Roland does something in construction. Doesn't he, Sadie?" Doesn't he? Like she was confirming a rumor rather than asking a question she didn't already have an answer to. He owns a construction company, Sadie said, which was true as far as it went, since Fenwick Bar and Vineyard Estates was legally structured under Fenwick Restoration and Holdings, a name that told you nothing about the size of what it actually held. Constance nodded slowly, filed me away under some category in her head, and moved on to asking Joanne about her garden club. Bennett's father Warwick Ashcroft, said maybe 11 words to me across that entire dinner, all of them about the Cooper River Bridge traffic. I don't hold quiet men against them. I am one, most days, but there's a difference between a quiet man and an absent one, and by the end of that first dinner I understood which kind Warwick was. He deferred to Constance on every decision, every opinion, every small social calculation, the way a man does when he stopped fighting a current a long time ago and just lets it carry him wherever it's headed. I remember driving home that night with Joanne, the two of us quiet for the first 10 minutes of the ride, the way you get quiet after an evening that didn't sit right, but you can't yet name why. What did you make of them? I finally asked. Joanne considered it a long moment. She's the kind of woman who spent her whole life being told she's gracious and believed it so thoroughly she never noticed she stopped actually being it somewhere along the way. I laughed at that because it was exactly right, and because Joanne has always had a gift for naming a thing precisely on the first try that takes me 3 tries to even circle. And him I feel sorry for, she said. There's a man in there somewhere. I don't think he's been let out in a long while. I didn't think much more about that dinner in the weeks that followed. I should have. Some evenings tell you everything you need to know about the next 14 months, if you're paying close enough attention, and I wasn't. Not yet. The engagement moved fast once it happened, the way these things do when 2 people are genuinely certain. Constance took over the planning almost immediately, and here's where I need you to understand something about my own daughter, because it matters for what happens later. Sadie is not a pushover. She argues cases with contractors twice her age and wins. But there's a particular kind of quiet warfare that mothers-in-law wage, one comment at a time, always deniable, always wrapped in a compliment, and even as sharp as 29-year-old in Charleston can find herself 12 rounds deep before she notices she's been in a fight at all. It started with the venue selection, which is its own strange irony, given everything that came after. Sadie wanted to get married at one of my properties, obviously, the Vineyard Estate outside Somerville, the original barn Joanne fell in love with 15 years earlier, now surrounded by 6 acres of muscadine vines and a reception hall I'd personally framed the roof trusses on. Constance had other ideas at first, floated a country club, a hotel ballroom downtown, anything with a name she recognized from a society page. Sadie held her ground, quietly, the way she does. It's my father's venue, Constance. It means something to us. Constance relented with the particular grace of a woman who's decided the battle isn't worth the optics of losing it publicly. And here's the detail that made the whole rest of this story possible. She never once asked what my father's venue actually meant. She assumed Sadie meant sentimental attachment, a nice place her dad had helped fix up once. She never connected Fenwick Restoration and Holdings, the name on every contract and deposit invoice, with Roland Fenwick, the quiet man in the flannel shirt she'd mentally filed under contractor. I run my properties under the holding company name specifically because I never wanted a booking to happen because of who I am instead of what the space offers. That habit, small and practical, was about to become the most useful thing I ever did. The cuts came steadily after the venue was settled. Small ones, easy to write off individually, which is exactly how that kind of thing survives. At the engagement party Constance hosted at her house, she introduced Joanne and me to her friends as Sadie's parents, never by name, while introducing her own side by full name, and, more than once, by their professional titles. At a cake tasting, she redirected every question toward what the Ashcroft side would prefer, as though Sadie belonged more to that family than to the one that raised her. When the seating chart came together for the rehearsal dinner, which Constance insisted on hosting and paying for, I found myself at a table near the kitchen door with 2 elderly Ashcroft cousins I'd never met, while Joanne sat one table further out. Bennett's grandparents, his aunts and uncles, half a dozen family friends with prominent last names, all clustered around the head table. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was a seating chart, not a referendum. There was a bridal shower, too, hosted by 2 of Constance's closest friends at a private club downtown, the kind of place with a dress code and a waiting list a decade long. Joanne wasn't excluded exactly, but she found herself seated at the far end of a long table, making conversation with women who kept steering every topic back toward people and places Joanne had no context for, the particular social exclusion that doesn't require anyone saying an unkind word out loud. She came home that afternoon and sat at our kitchen table without taking her coat off, staring at the wall for a good 10 minutes before she said anything to me at all. I felt like I was auditioning to be somebody's mother, she finally said, for a role I already have. I didn't have a good answer for that one. I still don't, entirely. Then there was the dress fitting, which Sadie told me about weeks later. Almost as an aside, the way you mention something only once you've had enough distance from it to talk about it lightly. Constance had come along, uninvited but somehow impossible to exclude, and had spent the appointment offering opinions on necklines that Sadie hadn't asked for, at one point suggesting, gently but audibly, that a more traditional silhouette might photograph better next to the Ashcroft family portraits that would presumably be displayed at the reception. Sadie, to her credit, held her ground and bought the dress she wanted. But she told me she cried in the car afterward, not because of the dress, but because it was the 5th or 6th time in 2 months she'd had to hold her ground against a woman who wasn't technically attacking anything, just quietly, persistently, redrawing the boundaries of whose wedding this actually was. Then came the wedding program proofs, 3 weeks before the ceremony. Sadie sent them over excited, wanting my opinion on the paper stock. I read through the credits page first, out of habit. I always read the fine print on anything with my name on it, professional reflex. My name wasn't on it. The reception line read, hosted with love by the Ashcroft family. No mention of the Fenwicks at all, despite the fact that Joanne and I were paying for the catering, the band, the open bar, and though nobody in that program apparently remembered, the entire venue itself. I called Sadie that night. Honey, the program says the Ashcrofts are hosting. A pause on her end, long enough that I understood she'd noticed too and hadn't said anything yet. Constance had the invitations designed before I saw them. I'll get fixed, Dad. I promise. She'd get it fixed, eventually, a small line added crediting both families. But the fact that it needed fixing at all told me everything about which direction this particular current was flowing. I want to tell you about the phone call, because it's the hinge this whole story swings on, and I need you to understand I wasn't looking for it. I'd stopped by the vineyard property myself on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks before the wedding, to walk the reception hall with my events manager, a sharp young woman named Priscilla, who's run day-to-day operations there for 6 years and knows every square foot of that building better than I do at this point. We were checking the new trellis lighting in the west corridor, the same corridor Constance's mother had complained was a touch rustic during the walkthrough, when Priscilla's phone buzzed with a call from the front office. I'd known Priscilla since she was 24, fresh out of a hospitality program at the College of Charleston, nervous as anything at her first interview, and I'd hired her mostly on the strength of one answer she gave when I asked how she'd handle a difficult client. She'd said, without hesitating, that difficult clients usually aren't difficult people, they're stress people, and the job was figuring out which one you were actually dealing with before you decided how to respond. 6 years later, she ran 3 properties with the same steady calm, and I trusted her judgment on client matters more than I trusted my own most days, precisely because she never let a stressed person's tone become her own. She stepped away to take the call, and I kept working, half listening the way you do in a quiet building, until I heard her voice shift into the careful, professional register she uses for difficult clients. Mrs. Ashcroft, I understand, but the contract terms were set when the booking was made. A pause. No, ma'am, I can't reduce the staffing gratuity pool the week of the event. That's built into the vendor agreements. Another pause, longer, and I watched Priscilla's jaw tighten in a way I'd only seen a handful of times in 6 years. Mrs. Ashcroft, I'll be honest with you. We discounted this booking substantially as a courtesy to the Fenwick family. I'm not in a position to discount it further. She hung up a minute later, saw me standing there, and had the good sense to look uncomfortable. You heard that. Some of it, I said. Tell me the rest. Here's what Priscilla told me, and here's what I pieced together over the following hour with our booking records pulled up on her laptop. Constance Ashcroft had called the front office that morning under the impression that the venue rental, a property she still had no idea I owned, had been secured through what she described to Priscilla as a favor from a friend on the board, referring to a mutual acquaintance who sits on a preservation society I fund. She'd apparently been telling her Charleston friends for weeks that she'd pulled strings to get her son's wedding into one of the more exclusive low-country venues at a steep discount, framing it as her own social capital at work rather than what it actually was. My daughter's father waiving the majority of his own rental fee as a wedding gift, structured quietly through the holding company so nobody would feel obligated or awkward about it. And now, apparently believing she got a bargain through her own connections, Constance was calling to see if she could also shave staff gratuities to bring the final bill down further, treating the servers, the coordinators, the setup crew, people who work 12-hour days on their feet for a living, people not unlike the men and women who had worked construction crews for me for 3 decades, as a line item to be negotiated down rather than human beings doing honest work. I stood in that corridor a long moment, looking at the trellis lighting I'd argued with an electrician about for 2 full days to get right, and felt something in my chest settle into a very specific, very calm kind of cold. I didn't say anything to Sadie that night. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was pride, plain and simple. I didn't want my daughter's last weeks of wedding planning consumed by her father's wounded feelings. But the larger part, the part that actually mattered, was that I needed time to decide what kind of correction the situation called for. There's a version of this story where I storm into the next planning meeting, announce that I own the building, and enjoy watching Constance's face collapse in real time. That version felt good to imagine and would have accomplished nothing except giving Sadie's wedding a story everyone would tell for the wrong reasons for the next 20 years. I didn't want to blow up my daughter's wedding. I wanted to correct exactly one thing, precisely, at exactly the right moment, and then get out of the way and let her have her day. I called Joanne that evening and told her everything. The program credits, the seating chart, the phone call, the gratuity pool. Joanne's quieter than me most days, but she's got a mind like a steel trap, and she was quiet a long moment after I finished. "You've been carrying all of this by yourself," she finally said. It wasn't a question. Didn't want to make it bigger than it was. "Ro." She used my full name, which she does maybe twice a year, always when she needs me to actually hear her. "It's already big. You've just been the only one pretending it isn't." She was right, the way she almost always is. We sat at our kitchen table that night, the same table where I'd taught Sadie long division and where Joanne had iced 3 decades of birthday cakes, and we made a plan. I called Priscilla first thing the next morning. "I want to walk the full reception setup with you before the wedding," I told her. Not as the owner checking in, as the father of the bride, making sure everything's exactly right for his daughter. Priscilla, God bless her, understood immediately without me needing to spell out further. "You want to be there, quietly, and make some adjustments. I want the day to go beautifully for Sadie," I said. "And I want one specific thing corrected at the right moment, in front of the right people." "What's the correction?" I told her, and she smiled for the first time since that phone call. "I can absolutely make that happen, Mr. Fenwick. Here's what I decided, sitting at that kitchen table with Joanne. I wasn't going to cancel the discount, humiliate Constance in front of 200 guests, or do anything that would cast even the faintest shadow over Sadie's actual wedding day. What I was going to do was make sure that by the end of the reception, every single person in that room, including Constance Ashcroft, understood exactly whose gift had made the day possible and exactly how that gift had been treated. Sometimes the most precise correction isn't the loudest one. It's the one that simply makes the truth impossible to keep misunderstanding. I didn't tell Sadie the full plan. I told her I wanted to give a toast, which fathers of the bride generally do, and I told her I'd cleared the timing with the coordinator, which was true. I told Joan everything. I told Priscilla everything. Bennett I left out entirely, partly out of respect for the fact that this was ultimately about his mother, not him, and partly because I suspected, correctly as it turned out, that Bennett had his own complicated relationship with Constance's particular brand of social choreography and didn't need to be put in the middle of it before the vows were even said. The week before the wedding, I did something I want to describe carefully because it wasn't spite, though I understand if it sounds like it. I had Priscilla pull the original booking file and print a clean copy of the venue rental agreement, the real one, with a real discount clearly itemized, structured as a gift from Fenwick Restoration and holdings to Sadie Fenwick and Bennett Ashcroft, dated and signed 8 months earlier, long before Constance had ever mentioned pulling any strings with anyone. I had that document framed, simply, no dramatics, matted in plain blackwood, and I asked Priscilla to have it placed discreetly in the reception hall's entry corridor among the other framed photographs of the property's restoration history. The same wall that showed the barn before and after, the vineyard rows going in, 15 years of the place becoming what it was. Just one more frame on a wall of frames. Anyone who read it closely would understand everything. Anyone who didn't would simply walk past it. I wasn't going to force the moment. I was going to make the truth available and let it find its own way to the people who needed to see it. The morning of the wedding was Charleston perfect. Low humidity for October. Sun coming through the oaks at exactly the angle I designed the west corridor windows to catch 15 years earlier without ever imagining it would light my own daughter's wedding day. I wore a suit I'd had tailored specifically for the occasion, dark navy, nothing flashy, the kind of suit that fits so well nobody thinks about it at all, which was precisely the point. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a father, nothing more performative than that, at least not yet. The photographer found me in the hallway outside the bridal suite around 11, camera already up, herding relatives toward the garden for the formal family portraits. Family photos in 5 minutes, she said, checking her list. Fenwick and Ashcroft, immediate family. I nodded, made my way out to the garden, found my spot beside Joanne, and watched Constance quietly redirect the photographer's assistant, murmuring something I couldn't quite hear. A minute later, the photographer approached me directly, apologetic, professional, clearly relaying instructions she'd been given rather than making a judgment of her own. "Sir, I'm so sorry. This round is immediate family only. We'll do the extended group next." I looked past her at the cluster already forming. Bennett's parents, his grandparents, his aunts and uncles, a small army of Ashcrofts arranging themselves with the practiced ease of people who'd done this before at other weddings, other confirmations, other family occasions I'd never been invited into. Sadie stood in the middle of it in her dress, and I watched her face do something complicated when she noticed I wasn't in the frame. Confusion, then recognition, then the beginning of anger, all in about 2 seconds. She started to step out of position. I caught her eye and gave the smallest shake of my head. "Not yet, baby. Let it happen the way it's going to happen." I stepped back, out of the shot, and let them take the photograph without me. I want to tell you honestly, that moment stung more than I expected it to, even knowing what I already knew, even having a plan already in motion. There's a particular kind of pain in being physically removed from a picture of your own family, gentle and procedural as the removal might be. I stood there in my tailor navy suit, on a property I'd built with my own hands, and for about 10 seconds I was just a father who'd been asked to step out of the frame. Then Joanne's hand found mine, quiet and certain, and the 10 seconds passed, and I remembered exactly what afternoon it was. The ceremony itself was, genuinely, one of the finest afternoons of my life, and I want that on the record before anything else happens in this story. Sadie walked down that aisle between the vineyard rows I planted with my own hands, and Bennett cried openly when he saw her, which told me everything I needed to know about that particular young man's character regardless of what family he'd been raised in. I walked her down myself, gave her away the way you're supposed to, and if my voice caught once or twice, nobody in that crowd needed to know why. I remember the specific weight of her hand on my arm during that walk, the way it had felt exactly the same, just larger, since she was 6 years old, and I used to walk her down our own driveway to the school bus stop, her small hand gripping 2 of my fingers instead of my whole arm. I remember thinking, halfway down that aisle, about every version of Sadie I'd ever walked somewhere. To her first day of kindergarten, to her mother's hospital room the week Joanne had her gallbladder out, to the stage at her college graduation, where she'd look back at me in the crowd before they called her name. This was just the latest walk, I told myself, the same girl, further down the same road. It helped, thinking of it that way. It's the only thing that got me through the aisle without my voice giving out entirely. The reception moved into the barn as the sun went down. String lights, I'd hung myself a week before catching the last of the light through the west windows exactly the way I designed them to 15 years earlier. Dinner service went smoothly. The band was excellent. And for a while, I let myself simply enjoy watching my daughter dance with her new husband, Constance's earlier maneuvering fading into the general noise of a genuinely happy celebration. Then the toast began, and it was my turn. I stood, tapped my glass, and the room quieted the way rooms do for a father about to speak. I looked at Sadie first, radiant, already a little teary, then let my eyes move slowly across the room. Bennett's family clustered near the front, Joan beside me, 200 of Charleston's finest waiting politely for the sentimental father of the bride's speech they expected. I gave them most of that speech, genuinely, because I meant every word of it. Stories about Sadie as a girl, about the barn she grew up running through, about watching her become the woman standing in front of me. I told them about the time she was 7 and insisted on helping me shingle the original barn roof. How she'd sat on the ladder's bottom rung for 2 full hours passing me nails one at a time with the gravity of a surgical nurse, certain she was doing the most important work on the entire job site. I told them about her first day of architecture school, how she called me from her dorm room that night not to talk about her classes, but to ask, almost shyly, whether I thought the barn still needed anything, like she was already looking for a way to put her new education to use on the place that had raised her. The room laughed in the right places and went quiet in the right places, and Constance dabbed her eyes at the appropriately sentimental parts, the way people do at weddings regardless of what's underneath the performance. Then, toward the end, I set my glass down for a moment and said, conversationally, almost as an aside, I want to thank everyone who helped make today possible, especially this venue, which means more to our family than most people here know. I paused just long enough. Some of you may not be aware that Fenwick Restoration and Holdings owns this property. I restored this barn myself, board by board, starting about 15 years ago. And when Sadie told me she wanted to get married here, my wife and I structured the entire rental as our wedding gift to her and Bennett, months before the invitations even went out. I let that land, watching very deliberately Constance's face across the room. I mention it now only because I understand there was some confusion recently about how the booking came together, and some concern about trimming costs on the staff gratuity pool for the incredible people working tonight. I want to be clear in front of everyone that every person working this event tonight is being paid in full, at full rate, because that's simply how we do things at Fenwick Properties, and because nobody who works this hard for my daughter's happiness is ever going home shorted on my watch. I raise my glass to Sadie and Bennett, and to everyone in this barn who worked to make tonight possible, seen and unseen. The room applauded, most of them entirely unaware of the specific correction that had just occurred in front of them, understanding only that the father of the bride had made a gracious, generous toast. But I watched 3 faces very carefully as I sat back down. Sadie's, lighting up with a slow, dawning understanding of exactly what her father had just quietly accomplished. Bennett's, genuinely moved, and, I'd learn later, genuinely unaware of most of what had preceded that toast, which told me something important about how carefully Constance had kept her son out of her own maneuvering. And Constance's, which had gone very still, very pale, the particular stillness of a woman recalculating, in real time, an entire social narrative she'd been constructing for months. Constance found me 20 minutes later near the bar, Warwick trailing a step behind her with the look of a man who understood something significant had shifted without fully grasping what. Roland. She'd never once, in 14 months, called me by my full first name instead of some careful approximation of politeness. I had no idea. I know, I said, keeping my voice even, pleasant, the same voice I use closing a contract I'm satisfied with. That was rather the point of keeping it quiet. Her composure cracked slightly, just at the edges. The phone call. With your events manager. I know about that too, I said, still pleasant, still calm. Priscilla handles those conversations professionally, every single time, regardless of who's on the other end of the line. That's why I trust her with my properties. Constance's face went through several rapid recalculations, landing somewhere close to genuine mortification, which, I'll admit, was more satisfying to witness than I expected, though I kept that satisfaction carefully off my own face. I would never have, she started. I know you wouldn't have said those things about the staff if you'd known I was standing in the building, I said, cutting in gently but completely. That's actually the part that concerns me more than the discount, Constance. Not that you didn't know it was mine, that you were comfortable saying it at all, to anyone. She had nothing to say to that. Warwick, for the first time in 14 months, opened his mouth and said something with actual weight behind it. She's right to be embarrassed, he said quietly, looking at his wife rather than at me. We should have asked more questions about this family a long time ago, Constance, instead of assuming we already had all the answers. It was, as far as I know, the single most direct sentence Warwick Ashcroft had spoken in 14 months of knowing him, and it landed harder in that moment than anything I could have said myself. I didn't need anything more from either of them after that. I excused myself, found Sadie on the dance floor, and asked her for the father-daughter dance a few minutes early, before the schedule called for it, because I found I genuinely couldn't wait any longer to hold my daughter and tell her how proud I was. She held on tight through most of the song, and near the end she pulled back just enough to look at me. You planned a whole toast. I planned exactly one sentence of it, I said. The rest was just me telling the truth about my daughter's wedding day. She laughed, half a sob in it, and hugged me again. We swayed there a while longer, past the point where the song had technically ended and the band had drifted into the next one without either of us noticing, and I thought about every dance we'd ever had together, really, spinning her around the kitchen when she was small enough to stand on my boots, the father-daughter dance at her middle school fundraiser, where she'd been mortified to be seen with me and thrilled about it at the exact same time, and now this one, the last one that would ever technically carry that title. I'm sorry I didn't push back harder, Dad, she finally said. On the seating, the program, all of it. I saw it happening, and I kept telling myself it wasn't worth the fight before the wedding. You were protecting your wedding, I said. That's not the same as not seeing it. I saw the same things you did. I just decided the correction could wait for the right moment instead of the first one. Was tonight the right moment? She asked. Tonight, I said, was exactly the right moment. Quiet enough not to overshadow you. Loud enough that nobody in that room misunderstands what happened here again. The rest of the reception unfolded the way good receptions do. Dancing, cake, Bennett's grandmother telling a slightly scandalous story about Warwick's own wedding 40 years earlier that made the whole head table laugh. Constance quieter than usual, but present. Gracious in the particular careful way of someone rebuilding a story about herself in real time. She found me once more near the end of the night, this time alone, Warwick nowhere in sight. I owe you an apology, she said, and I could hear it cost her something to say it plainly, without the usual cushioning. A real one, not a performed one. I made assumptions about you the first night we met, and I never once corrected them, because correcting them would have meant admitting I was wrong about something. That's on me, not on you. I studied her a moment. I appreciate you saying that. Will you accept it? She asked. I'll accept that you said it, I told her honestly. Whether I accept the apology itself depends a little on what changes after tonight. Sadie and Bennett are going to build a life together, and that means our families are stuck with each other for the next 50 years, God willing. I'd rather spend those 50 years finding out who you actually are than deciding tonight based on who you've been so far. She nodded slowly, something that looked like genuine respect crossing her face for the first time since I'd met her. That's fair, she said. More fair than I probably deserve tonight. Probably, I agreed, and for the first time in 14 months, we both actually laughed. 6 months have passed since that wedding. Constance and I aren't close. I don't expect we ever will be. Not entirely. Some foundations, once poured wrong, don't fully reset no matter how much concrete you pour over the crack. But something did shift. She calls Joan now, occasionally, about garden club business, genuine calls, not performative ones. She's asked me twice for recommendations on contractors for a renovation at her own house, which I understand, from a woman like Constance, is its own quiet form of respect. At Thanksgiving, the two families gathered together for the first time since the wedding, Sadie and Bennett's new house not yet finished. So we hosted at our place instead. Joanne's dining table extended with the leaf we only use twice a year. Constance arrived with a pecan pie she'd made herself, not catered, and I watched her hand shake slightly setting it down. The particular nervousness of a woman and used to walking into a room where she isn't automatically the one setting the terms. She complimented Joanne's cooking 3 separate times, genuinely, and asked me, almost shyly, whether I'd mind showing her the framing work on Sadie and Bennett's new place sometime. Said she'd always been curious how a house actually goes together underneath the parts you're supposed to look at. I told her I'd be glad to. I'm in it mostly. Warwick and I had lunch alone once, a few months back, at his suggestion, and he talked for nearly an hour about his own father, a man apparently even quieter and more absent than Warwick himself had been for most of his life, and I understood a little better, by the end of that lunch, exactly what kind of current he'd been letting carry him for so many decades. He told me, near the end of that lunch, that watching his son cry openly at his own wedding had done something to him he hadn't expected, made him realize how many of his own big moments he'd spent standing carefully to one side of, afraid of exactly what feeling that much in public might cost him. I didn't know quite what to say to that, so I just told him it wasn't too late to stand a little closer to the middle of things. He laughed, quiet and a little sad, and said he'd try. I believe, mostly, that he has. I don't know that we'll ever be close either, Constance and I, or Warwick and I. But I think we understand each other now in a way we didn't before, and that's worth more than I expected it to be. Sadie and Bennett are building their own life now. A house going up in West Ashley that I'm framing myself on weekends. Same as I did with the barn 15 years ago. Same as I'll probably keep doing until my knees finally give out entirely. Priscilla still runs the vineyard property, and a framed rental agreement still hangs quietly in that entry corridor among the restoration photographs. One more frame on a wall of frames, available to anyone who reads closely enough to understand what it means. Most people walk right past it. That's fine. It was never really there for them. It was there for exactly one moment, on exactly one afternoon, for exactly the people who needed, finally, to see it clearly. I think about that photographer sometimes, the one who asked me to step out of the family portrait, apologetic and professional, just relaying instructions she'd been given. She wasn't wrong to ask. She didn't know what she was asking, and neither, really, did the woman who told her to ask it. I built a good life out of understanding something most people learn too late, if they learn it at all, that the truth doesn't need to be loud to be complete. Sometimes it just needs the right room, the right moment, and one framed piece of paper on a wall that somebody, eventually, was always going to read.